Hello everyone, welcome to the YRP's East Midlands Regions webinar. I'm Gavin Milevsky, I'm the Chair for the East Midlands region. Today we've got David Clarke from the Railway Industry Association, and he's going to speak to us about decarbonisation. David is going to answer questions today. He's going to answer those at the end. If you want to ask a question, then you can either use the questions box or you can use the raise your hand function, and we'll do our best to answer those and unmute you individually. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you for the invitation to speak to the YRP. I think we've also perhaps got some members of the Institute of Railway Operators online as well, so welcome to them too. I'm going to talk this afternoon about rail decarbonisation, but also the RIA electrification cost challenge, and I'll explain what that's all about. So what we're going to cover this afternoon, what we're going to cover this afternoon is a little bit of an introduction to RIA and the electrification cost challenge. We're going to talk about what's happened in electrification since 2007, what we learned from the National Electrification Programme, importantly, establishing what electrification should cost if it's delivered efficiently, and then, most importantly of all, talk about how we might move on to decarbonising the railway. When it comes to Q&A, I've got lots of information in benchmarking and lessons learned, which I might refer to answer some of your questions. First of all, if you don't mind, a little bit of an introduction to what RIA is, because it's quite possible that any of the people on the call who are members of, who work for supply companies are actually members of RIA, but you may not know that. So what is RIA? We're the trade association for UK-based suppliers. We've been around since 1875, believe it or not. What do? We represent your interests to government, regulators, Network Rail, etc. Offer a forum for dialogue, which is what we're doing here today, and provide lots of opportunities for our members to engage. Now, if you are, if you do work for a member company, then actually all you need to do is go onto our website and create yourself a login with that sign-in button, and then you can access all our information and attend our events, etc., etc. So do that if you remember. So if I can just explain a little bit about the RIA electrification cost challenge. Why did we do that? Well, we did that because, as I will touch on momentarily, and you'll probably all be aware of, the railway had managed to destroy its confidence with government in our ability to deliver electrification. So what we wanted to do was restore that government confidence and demonstrate that actually their lack of confidence was misplaced, because we were, as an industry, delivering 75% of our projects cost efficiently. Clearly 25% is a problem, but we, as I'll show you, we were rapidly learning lessons, and hence the role of the report in identifying good practice. We wanted to call for a rolling programme of electrification, and I'll explain why that's really, really important. And this was all before the climate change agenda reached the point that it is now, where we're committed in law to decarbonise, reach net zero carbon by 2050. I think we would say that we've been fairly successful at moving the dial on the policy. If you look at these two statements from the then Secretaries of State in 2017 and 2019, in 2017, when Chris Grayling was cancelling many of the electrification projects, then you can see there's a pretty negative set of statements there, and relying upon what was at that point in time considered to be, as it were, the get out of jail cards that avoided the need to further electrification, namely the introduction of bimodes. Now, obviously, time has moved on, and along has come the Climate Change Commission and highlighted the need to get to net zero carbon by 2050. which means that even bi-modes by 2050 will not be an acceptable solution. Move the clock forward, and by last year, we had Grant Shapps, the then Secretary of State, recognising that there would need to be much greater use of rail electrification in order to decarbonise. So what does that look like historically? So going back to 2007, it's been a bit of a stop-start situation. So back in 2007, there was a white paper published by government, which basically turned its face against the idea of further electrification. And thankfully, the industry got itself together in the shape of Ian Coucher and Adrian Shooter, who at the time were the chief executives of Network Rail and ATOC. They wrote to the government saying that that was not a sensible way to run a railway long term, and that carrying your power station around with you was not an efficient way to operate. And fair play to the government, they recognised that and accepted that advice. And by 2009, the situation had turned around to that white paper, which tiny little picture of there, which was recommending a major programme of electrification. Well, major, three lines: Great Western, main line, and a number of lines in the northwest of England. One of the problems we had, which gave rise to the lack of confidence in later years, was we got so enthusiastic about electrification between 2009 and the beginning of CP5 in 2012 that we decided to do not two or three projects, but 12 projects, which led to that cost escalation in the middle of the diagram, which you'll see again, which led to headlines in the BBC here, and a National Audit Office report in 2016. Now, whatever project you're working on, it is not a good thing to have a National Audit Office report. That is not a place you want to be. And that ultimately led to what I've already alluded to in 2017, the cancellation of a number of those electrification programs and the curtailment of the Great Western Programme at that stage. So that was the point in time where we launched the Electrification Cost Challenge, because we believe that electrification is the most efficient way to run most cost-effective way to run an efficient railway. And we wanted to demonstrate that that we could deliver electrification efficiently. Only 6 months later, slightly out of the blue, I don't think his officials even knew he was going to do this, up popped Joe Johnston, and the then rail minister, and declared that he wanted to see all diesel-only trains, and there's an important nuance there, diesel-only trains off the network by 2040. That gave rise to a piece of work called the Decarbonisation Task Force, which I was involved in, and more of that later. But back to electrification. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story, narrative about the electrification programme in CP5. And it's important to say that we're not pointing the finger here. This is not a blame game. We're trying to learn lessons. And while some projects were going badly wrong, many other projects have been successfully delivered. So let's look at that programme, the CP5 programme. It started well, but as I've already alluded, we probably got a bit carried away with ourselves. Instead of just doing Great Western and the Northwestern electrification scheme, by the time we got to the beginning of CP5, we were going to do all of these projects. And it was recognised that that was a huge growth in volume. And if I go back to the previous slide, you can see that in the CP4, there was about 200 million of electrification done in the previous control period, which was mainly West Coast Main Line refurbishment. And we were going to leap to 4 billion in CP5. Now that's quite a leap. And that huge growth was recognised. There's many clever people in the industry, and they realised that we needed to address these issues. But some of the challenges were perhaps not as recognised as they might have been. And although I think compliance with current standards is a bit of a red herring, the issue was that in that regard that not that these standards were difficult to comply with, but people didn't necessarily bring themselves up to date and realise that they needed to use the latest standards, believe it or not. I'm going to touch on these things in the coming slides, but one of the major things is this acceleration from 200 million to 4 billion over 5 years, and the lack of experienced resources across the whole industry. Also, an immaturity of design and program. One of the key learnings here is that before we decided to before we ascertained the cost of electrifying Great Western and the sensible programme to electrify it, we'd already committed to have electric trains running to Paddington from Paddington by 2018. So we'd already set the end date before we knew how we were going to deliver it. So what happened and what have we learned? Sorry, slight delay on the slide here. Yeah, okay. Well, one of the things that we learned, as I've already suggested, is that it's helpful to have a realistic program, not to set the delivery date before you've worked out how you're going to deliver, and have sufficient resource on hand commensurate with the volume of work that you're going to deliver. The graph on the left is a graph from that 2009 white paper. And so, if you like, the warning was already written on the wall, because what you see here is the amount of electrification done in the UK since the 60s. And you can pick out, for those who know, West Coast and then East Coast in the 80s. And then, frankly, 20 years of not a lot. Now, whatever it is you do for a living, if you don't do it for 20 years and then leap into a program of the scale of the one on the right, I would suggest you're going to have a bit of a learning curve to climb. So we had 20 years with very little electrification, and then we were launching into 2,000 kilometres of electrification with very rapid ramp up. We were also bringing in novel technology. For all the right reasons, it was proposed to use a high output system, and the emphasis is on system here. It comprised two parts. It comprised a new modular approach to the overhead line in the pictures on the left, and a factory train or factory trains plural to support the installation. And there was a huge amount of merit in that. And ironically enough, as we sit here today, we could probably, we've largely got that system working. The problem is that, again, because we had launched into a program very quickly, we found ourselves in a situation where the delivery and proving of this new system was overlapping with the delivery of the project. Now, I am very much for innovation and very much for high output and productivity, but I would suggest that a 1,000-kilometre long mainline project is not the place to test out your new technology. If we'd built a year into the programme and taken it off to some lower profile branch line somewhere and proven it and ironed out the problems, I think we would have been in much better shape, because as I will show you, once things start to go wrong on a major route like Great Western, then they rapidly escalate. And we had a situation, and this is probably the most well-known example of that phenomena. It's the foundations, it's the foundation piles, and again, for all the right reasons, the proposal was to install steel circular hollow section piles. They were to be installed by this factory train, and that made an awful lot of sense. But in the system, in the in the way that we very rapidly had to mobilise, we were doing a number of things as an industry in parallel. We were designing the foundations, and we were also procuring the train. So the train was procured on the basis that it would put in the kind of piles that historic experience said were the norm. So they would be typically 3.5, maybe at most 5 meters long, and they would be positioned in the cess, roughly where that path is. And what you can see here actually is you can see a cable in the cess, and this is one of the two major problems with the pilings. First of all, as many people would know, on Great Western, there isn't cable troughing. The cables are usually buried roughly in the cess there, roughly where you'd want to put your piles. And the second problem is that the increased loading on the overhead line system was felt to be beyond the experience range of the previous empirical foundation design, and therefore the designers went back to first principles. And if there are any engineers on the call, they will know that earthworks or soils and limit state design are not happy bedfellows. And so you end up with very onerous designs, which means very long piles. Again, engineers on the call will know that if you have a crane like this pile driver here, then the further out you have to go, the lower its capacity. So if, as was the case, the decision was made to put the piles further out so as not to have to reposition the signalling cables, then the capacity of the crane gets reduced. And then you're installing much longer piles, which makes it even worse for the crane. So guess what? The crane couldn't drive many of the piles, which left a sort of hit and miss approach where there was, as you can see here in the picture, there was gaps where piles should have been. Now, in a possession regime, once the idea was that the train went out and put in a continuous length of piles. The only thing that matters in electrification is not counting piles, but counting continuous runs, what's called a construction length. And because then you can come back and put all of the steel work in on top of that. What we ended up with was piles being missed. Instead of the train being down the line putting in the next batch of piles, it had to be back filling in the gaps. Possessions are precious on Great Western and everywhere else on the railway. Once that started going wrong, they were into an absolute spiral. And that's what this spiral did to the costs. I think the correct cost of Great Western is the cost shown in 2013. The two previous costs are early estimates. And just as we see on other major projects, then as we get more and more knowledgeable of what needs to be done, the cost escalates until the point where it reaches stability and something that's deliverable, which, as I say, is about the 2013 number. 2016, it had gone badly wrong. What had happened between 2013 and 2016? Well, we'd gone out on site and started to experience all of those problems that I've just described, and that spiral and that need to rework and that lost productivity was basically the increase in costs between 2013 and 2016. So that's a quick overview of what went wrong with Great Western, and I'm happy to take more questions on that. The question we were trying to answer with the electrification cost challenge is what electrification should cost. So what we did is we went out and looked at what it was costing, and we analysed about 20 projects. And as we half suspected, we found that 3/4 roughly of those projects inside that shaded box were delivering for what we consider to be an efficient range of cost, for less than £1.5 million per single track kilometre. And we found that simpler projects could deliver at much less than that, and we were finding projects that were being delivered well less than £1 million per single track kilometre, which compares to the well over 2.5 million that was being experienced on Great Western. As you can see there from the saltires at the bottom of the graph, Scotland has been quite successful in delivering electrification efficiently, and there's certainly a lot of lessons to learn from the Scottish programme. The little black blobs are worth mentioning. They are the projects which are well known for being problem projects. And you might ask, therefore, why are the two within the shaded box problem projects? And that's because they are Edinburgh, Glasgow and Gospel Oak Barking. And that's because it was the non-electrification elements which, when added in, caused them to significantly exceed their costs. Because you can't read this data, for example, doesn't include things like bridges and structures, because you can't measure those as a unit rate. As you'll appreciate, those will vary in quantum from route to route. So what we take from that is that you can deliver efficiently. There is an efficient cost range. Complexity is a cost driver, and of course, access is a cost driver. But we think there's scope to do better. This is another version of that graph I showed earlier, extended. So the red bars are, as it says there, West Coast, then East Coast, then a 20-year gap, and then the National Electrification Programme in CP5. And as you can see, those red bars represent what RIA would call feast and famine, or a boom and bust. And one of the reasons we would argue that we had problems in CP5, as I've already mentioned, is because we was quite simply, as an industry, the whole industry was out of practice. Now that little yellow line that's waving, that's sort of bumping around about 200 kilometres a year, that's how much Germany has done every year for the last 50 years. And guess who is more efficient at electrification? If we go back to the previous slide, you'll see Germany, and indeed that well-known low-cost economy Switzerland, are very much at the bottom end, i.e. the most efficient end of the spectrum. So we would argue that we should take a leaf out of the Germans' book and have a rolling programme of electrification. And we've recommended that when we published the report back in early 2019. But that was before the agenda changed quite significantly. So historically, we've always seen electrification as the most efficient way to run an intensively used railway. But then climate change really came to the fore. And that brings us to the question of decarbonisation. So I've already mentioned Joe Johnston's challenge in February 2018, which was to take all diesel-only trains off the track by 2040. And that was diesel only, so bi-modes would have been allowed, because as you know, his boss, the then Secretary of State, Chris Grayling, was seeing bi-modes as the way to avoid electrification. And so he called on a vision for the industry as to how to decarbonise. So a number of us got together and established the Decarbonisation Task Force. But not long after we started that, along came the Climate Change Commission and set the goal for net zero carbon by 2050 for the UK as a whole. That ultimately became enshrined in UK law. The Scots have gone one better, and they're looking to achieve net zero carbon for the whole economy by 2050, and they're looking to have zero carbon rail by 2035, which, you know, let's focus on that. It's 15 years away. So if you are going to decarbonise the industry, what's involved? What would you have to do? Well, the first bit is the good news. 70% of the problem's already solved, because 70% of the fleet nationally is already electric, and that carries something like more than 80% of the passengers. But there's also, and I'll come back to passengers in a moment, But there's also 850 freight locomotives, but only about 10% of those are electric. Now, I think you'll probably appreciate that freight is a particular challenge due to the tonnage that it holds in terms of converting it to alternative technologies. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So if you had a problem to solve and 70% of it is already solved, then that's quite helpful. So what have we got to replace by 2050? Well, if we look at the pie chart on the right, you've got to think about rolling stock in terms of its duty cycle. So we've got about 800, can't read mine right, about 800 75-mile-an-hour DMUs, about 1,600 100-mile-an-hour DMUs, about just under 1,000 125-mile-an-hour self-powered vehicles. That's reduced a bit now as some of the HSTs have been retired, and about 1,000 bi-modes, but that's actually still going up. So if you think about those different duty cycles, what are the different solutions that are available? So this is a piece of work from the Decarbonisation Task Force done on their behalf by RSSB. And what it shows is that for all the different duty cycles, the different speed ranges and freight, the only technology other than diesel, which you won't be able to use by 2050, the only technology that can do everything is electric. That has the downside that it needs electrification infrastructure, which obviously costs money. Diesel bi-mode can do most things, and we're likely to see 125-mile-an-hour bi-mode on the Midland Main Line, but they don't necessarily have the full performance in electric mode, and they're not carbon-free, so you won't be able to have them by 2050. Hydrogen self-power can certainly do up to 90 miles an hour. They have a slightly lower range than DMUs, but they can't do freight and they can't do 125 mile an hour. And they can't do those two things, particularly freight, because you need something like 9 times the volume to store the same energy in a hydrogen form than you do compared to diesel. Battery also has a role, particularly for the lower speeds and short hops, if you like, off the wires, maybe up to 60 miles range. But the energy density of batteries is even poorer. It's probably about 20 times the volume you need compared to diesel. So what we're saying, as you might have already guessed, is that electrification is the way forward for intensively used routes. And for all the reasons that have always been true, it's quieter, it costs less in the long term compared to diesel, it improves journey times, it's lighter, it reduces passenger delays as they're more reliable. But first and foremost, in the current environment, it's 60% lower the emissions than diesel trains with today's mix, and 80% lower with the estimated 2040 grid mix, and no air pollutants at the point of use. So it's the way forward for decarbonisation. On the journey time and speed point, that's nicely illustrated by the timetable on the right, which is Great Western when they had the new electric trains running in the diesel train timetable. And as you can see, the acceleration of the electric train was allowing it to arrive 6 minutes early at most stops, which just graphically illustrates the operational benefits of electrification. So hence we did the electrification cost challenge, and therefore we are recommending that electrification is the way forward for intensively used routes, both passenger and freight. The hydrogen self-power is for the less intensively used, long, straggly routes. Think the far north of Scotland, West Cornwall, etc., etc. Battery gaps in the electrification and last mile duties, and diesel bi-mode as a transitional arrangement. And at the end of that process, well, hopefully we drop out the diesel engines and they become an electric train. So what might that look like at as a national strategy. So this graph on the left is network length on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And what we're trying to explain here is the top-down argument for further electrification, lots of it. If we're currently as a network about 40% electrified, then it's looking like we'll need to be something like 80% electrified to deliver net zero carbon, certainly if we're going to maintain and hopefully increase the level of freight, rail freight. For the less intensively used parts of the network, we use hydrogen, self-powered trains, hydrogen and battery. And then the question is this grey wedge in the middle, which is where currently diesel and bi-mode and other hybrids exist. And the question will be whether that grey wedge comes down to nothing, or we have to use the net zero carbon approach and offset any rump of diesel with appropriate offset approaches. The key challenge, as I've already said, is freight. The energy density of alternative fuels mean that as far as we can see at the moment, then the only real option for freight is electrification, possibly bi-modes for last mile type of duties. But I'd argue we have to start now, and there's a great opportunity. There's over 1,000 self-powered DMUs which are coming to the end of their life. Decisions need to be made in the next 5 years. You're probably aware there's quite a number of prototype and developmental hybrid and battery trains about. So we would argue that there isn't a need for further experimentation. Actually, what we need to do is get some fleet orders out there to stimulate the market and move us forward. The important thing to remember here is that a ton of carbon saved in 2020 is 30 tons saved by 2050. Whereas a ton saved in 2049 is only 1 ton. So we need to crack on. And therefore, let's start with some fleet orders for the less intensively used parts of the network, and let's start a rolling programme of electrification for the intensively used parts. So what might that look like if we go back to a speculative update of that timeline that I showed before? In the last 18 months, the mood music has changed quite dramatically. There's been a plethora of publications from various bodies, RIA, the Decarbonisation Task Force, Transport Scotland, even the DFT. And the DFT came out earlier this year with Transportation Decarbonisation Strategy, which says we recognise that electrifying more of the railway is likely to be necessary to deliver decarbonisation. We're expecting Scotland to publish a rolling programme in the not too distant future. Hopefully Transpennine route upgrade will get going with some electrification. The worry though is that because of the funding cycle in the railways, we might not get started with a programme in England and Wales until 2025, the start of CP7. Now, what might that rolling programme look like? Well, there's quite a bit of work going on looking at that. And this is an extract from a piece of work that's led by Network Rail, thing called the TDNS, the snappily named Transport Decarbonisation Network Strategy. And what that's saying there is that in July, that will publish the first output from it, decarbonisation recommendations. And then in October, we'll publish a programme business case, which is the thing that government will look to for justifying the funding. What effectively that July document will be is, in my mind, a map of the network showing what will be electrified in order to, or what needs to be electrified in order to achieve net zero carbon. And the importance of that, at least once it's funded, is that gives certainty to the industry for the infrastructure side in terms of planning electrification, and for the rolling stock side in terms of planning their rolling stock strategy. The issue, however, is that gap, the gap between today and the beginning of CP7 and a potential programme. And the problem we've got as an industry is that the small number of existing electrification programmes, Great Western from Bristol to Cardiff has just finished, that delivered in the efficient range that we are talking about. So the early phases of Great Western, very inefficient. The last phase in the right range. That's finished. That team's been demobilised. Midland Main Line is really the only active electrification project at the moment. When that gets to Wellingborough, that's going to stop, and the team are going to demobilise. So we're at risk of losing our capability as an industry, just like we did at the end of East Coast Main Line, and then wanting them all back again in 2025. Now, just to put that into perspective, this is what that looks like. In order to get to something like 80% of the network electrified, we'd have to do as much or almost as much electrification every year for 20, 25 years as we've ever done in the past. So it would be a bit careless to demobilise all those teams just now. So therefore, what we're calling for as the Railway Industry Association is for some immediate orders for small volumes of electrification to keep that capability alive and start to build it up and start to do the designs for CP7 so that we can hit the ground running in 2025 and deliver efficiently. Because the last time we saw a cliff edge like that, or a cliff to climb like that, was the beginning of CP5, and we're determined not to make those mistakes again. But notwithstanding what I said about a ton of carbon saved today, we just do need to pace ourselves because if we were to be ambitious, and you can imagine politicians wanting to bring forward the decarbonisation deadline, if we were to try and do that by 2040 in 15 years, then just look at the volume that we've got to deliver each year. And then, of course, after that, once you've delivered that, there is no more electrification capital works because you've done as much as you're ever going to do. And therefore, the only work in the industry is maintenance, which is not too insignificant, but in terms of maintaining a supply chain, we need to think carefully about how we plan these things. So that brings me to the close of a whistle-stop tour of potential decarbonisation strategy. I have got some benchmarking and lessons learned slides, but I'm going to propose I'll pull those out depending on the questions that get asked. So I'm very happy now to take any questions there might be. So Gavin, do you want to, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you everyone for sending in your questions. We've got a few. So Sam has asked that the industry in general seems to be reluctant to train resources and that they see that as a barrier to project costs and timescales. And he's asking how you think that can be rectified.
Okay, well, that's a really good question. And I would say one of the reasons that the industry is usually reluctant to do so is because we go through this feast and famine process. And so the pipeline is only as long as the next project. And it's quite difficult. So the suppliers find it very difficult to justify a high level of recruitment before they've won a project. So in uncertainty of the pipeline, that drives a reluctance to recruit and build resources. So the fantastic news about us having or the fantastic potential news about us having a rolling program of electrification is you have that profile for 25 years. And that's a massive signal to recruitment and training and upskilling. And so the conversation we want to have in the next couple of years is we want to get the principles established in the coming months and then build the detail in the next couple of years. That conversation has to be about the whole industry ramping up for that level of delivery, about 450 kilometers a year every year for 25 years. And that's as much as we did in CP5. Now, we need to build mutual confidence in the industry because actually supply chain was asked to do that in CP5. Because CP5 went badly wrong, lots of those people that were recruited were then let go. And so there'll have to be absolute mutual confidence that this program is going to happen. But if it does, I think we'll see a lot of recruitment, and 25 years of work is more than most people can look forward to it with confidence in their career. I think there's some really good news around the corner.
Thank you very much for that. Our next questions come from Heather, and it's a relatively long one, which she apologises for in advance, but we'll break it down a little bit. So she's more interested in the total carbon savings over the life cycle of OLE, considering embedded carbon in construction. She's asking, does the electrification cost for decarbonisation consider embedded carbon? And if so, what is the value placed on this life cycle carbon in the design and selection process? And then how long before there is a payback in terms of carbon saving, depending on the duty cycle?
Okay, that's not yet fully embedded, but that would be something that would have to be embedded in the OBC. I don't know what the O stands for, but in the business case that will have to be developed in the next year or so. As the audience may be aware, it's now an expectation and quite rightly a requirement that all railway infrastructure projects have to use have to evaluate their embedded carbon, and we use a tool developed by RSSB, the carbon something tool, which assesses the embedded carbon, and that has to be factored into the business case. And that, I think, will drive, as we're seeing it, and it's happened on major projects like HS2, where that sort of approach has driven a lot of design optimization to reduce embedded carbon. And I think we'll see exactly that happening on this program, whether we optimization around the foundations, around all the structures. There's opportunities for innovation around, for example, composites, structures, and so forth. So I think that will be, well, it'll be a requirement, and I think therefore it'll be a key driver. Any project, the government sets out to compare any project, whether it's in across all the sectors in equal way. So they have a thing called the 5-case business model, and they will weigh all the permutations, including carbon, against a, for example, they'll compare the option to spend money on, say, roads versus railway versus another sector. And you may have seen in the press that at the moment the government's coming under a fair amount of criticism in the road sector, and not necessarily properly valuing carbon. Right, to the best of my understanding, the railway is valuing it properly, so should be able to counter that argument. Another factor to consider is that at the moment, there's a lot of people would say, probably quite correctly, that the value attached to carbon in the government's business cases is far too low, doesn't reflect the net zero carbon agenda. And I would expect it's quite likely that the value of carbon in business cases will increase in the net as the government reviews its business case criteria. So again, that will drive the right behaviour around life cycle carbon, both operational and embedded. So long answer to a long question.
Yeah, we've got plenty of questions flooding in now.
Good, excellent.
So Thomas is saying, you say that we need those fleet orders soon, but now the DfT has taken over all franchises. Do you think the DfT will start that process before letting new franchises, or will it just set the franchise competition rules so that new electric rolling stock offers get high scores? And if the latter, how do we stop West Coast Mainline Virgin Trains versus rail track situation from arising again?
Okay, well, I wish I had a crystal ball to know what might happen with the franchise, the future of franchises. So I'd just be speculating, so I'm not going to go into that. But what I would say is that given that it is the law for us to be at net zero carbon by 2050, I can't imagine that a future franchise specification or whatever it is the replacement for franchises, I can't imagine a future specification would allow you to buy a diesel because if rolling stock life cycles being what they are, then anything we buy in 2020 will still have a useful life in 2050. So I would be astonished if the department didn't write future specifications in a way that would preclude buying of certainly passenger diesels. Freight is a different situation, and I think the government is starting to acknowledge that there will have to be some, again, this is about confidence, there will have to be some mutual confidence between the freight industry, which is the genuinely privatized part of the industry, and the government in order that the freight industry can see the business case for investing in new rolling stock. And the kind of conversation you could imagine happening there is that the government convincing the industry that they really are committed to electrifying a very substantial amount of railway, and therefore there is a business case because of the operational savings of electric over diesel for the freight industry to go out and spend £3-4 million a loco on replacing some of their existing fleet. And that's the kind of mutual confidence building that's going to be really, really important. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question from Martin, and he asks, how does the industry create the political will, and he adds, especially with COVID, to create a strategy for electrification?
I think actually the mood music is pretty good. Actually, as I alluded to, there's been a flurry of government and other documentation saying that there needs to be more. There needs to be, first of all, railway decarbonisation, and secondly, quite a lot of electrification to support that. So the pronouncements and statements that are coming from ministers and politicians generally are pretty positive. If you went back to the election before Christmas, that seems like a long time ago now, if you analysed all the political manifestos, every one of them was talking about railway electrification. I don't think I can remember another occasion where there was much mention of railways in political manifestos, never mind anything remotely positive like electrification or remotely consistent across all parties. So there's quite a level of cross-party support. Regarding the COVID situation, actually, the railway has been able to demonstrate that it's been able to continue working during this period, and government recognised that stimulating the economy post-COVID is going to require not only the railway to keep running, but that there be continued investment across infrastructure generally. And the whole levelling up agenda, despite the fact that the Treasury are going to be very short of cash as they pay back for all of the support they've given during coronavirus. Again, politicians at the moment have been very consistent, both Labour and Conservative have been very consistent about the need to spend and spend big on infrastructure post-COVID. And electrification and indeed rolling stock orders are things that you can do somewhat faster than, say, a major new scheme that's designed from the ground up.
Okay, we've got a question from Matt, and he says he wants to ask how you see the rail industry working with the energy industry to ensure that network capacity is in place as we hope to increase electrification through the UK.
Okay, that's a really good question. I mean, the electricity industry as a whole is having to change massively and is recognising that that demand for electricity is going to change at the same time as they're having to decarbonise. They've got very robust plans for how they're going to manage that. There are some big unknowns, like how much or how little nuclear as a base load. But they've spent a lot of time and effort making their network bi-directional so that it can both deal with renewables. So there is some high-level collaboration there, but essentially, I think as an industry, we're relying upon giving our projections of demand to the electricity industry and for them planning to provide it. However, one of the big opportunities here is energy efficiency, and it's far more beneficial all round to reduce your consumption of electricity through efficiency than it is to generate it and then use it inefficiently. And the electricity industry are focusing on that heavily, and the rail industry has got a good news story there. We've got regen, we've got a big program in Network Rail on non-traction energy, and also Network Rail are actively looking. You may have heard of the Project Sunbeams, which some people have scoffed at in terms of a line-side solar power installation, but scale that up mentally. If the rail industry invests in line-side renewables, then the transmission losses are negligible. So back to that efficiency point, if there's negligible transmission losses, then you are using much more of the electricity you generate. So it's renewables. Line-side renewables is definitely a possibility. I mean, it won't power the railway in its entirety, but around the edges, it will make us more efficient. There's also, and part of that question might have been about how do we make sure we avoid the areas of weak power we have on the network currently. So some of you may be aware that there are places on the network where the wires are up, but we're limited as to how many trains we can run because we haven't historically put in the maximum power supply. So there's a number of techniques we can use to address that, one of which might be line-side energy storage, battery farms, and so forth. Another thing might be there's technology available now where you can tap into the local electricity grid for the railway rather than having to go into the high voltage national grid, and it's an order of magnitude more expensive to go into the national grid than it is to go into the local grid. Sorry, another long answer.
So another question has come in from James, and he's asking, have any efforts to increase the capacity of the newly electrified lines being considered? And he gives an example of ETCS. And he asks, would the cost to update signalling at the same time as electrification have any cost savings to further increase capacity?
Okay, well, the first rule of electrification is don't ossify the existing network by just simply sticking the masts up around what you've got. You need to look at the network that you need for the future. So that means both in terms of track layout, because once you put the masts up, it's rather a lot more expensive if you suddenly decide you need to change the track layout. So first and foremost, you should consider the right track layout for the long term. Signalling, as James highlights, is an important consideration. And there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation here. If the existing signalling hasn't been immunized, so in other words, can be affected by the stray current from 25,000 volts in the neighborhood, then that can drive up the cost of electrification because you have to immunize it before you electrify it. but that might actually justify accelerating the rollout of ETCS, which James alludes to. And a perfect world would be where we run those two programs in parallel, because as I think James is alluding to, you get benefits out of both technologies. So electrification will give you higher acceleration, and ETCS, if you do it signals away, can increase your capacity because you're not limited to signal sighting distances, signal locations. You can put in more track blocks, which allows you to increase the capacity. So a really intelligent program would be to do those two things together. Now, at the risk of keeping too much on Her Majesty's Treasury's plate, another piece of work that I'm involved in is looking at what the ETCS program might need to look like in CP7, and we are looking. We're coming up to a bit of a perfect storm in the signalling world, where there's been a low level of signalling renewals in recent years because everybody's been waiting for the wonderful new signalling from ETCS, and that has built up a backlog, and we're going to need to start tackling that backlog in CP7. And we've been working with Network Rail and others to work out how, again, we ramp up. And I use the term getting match fit, and it applies for both signalling and electrification. The industry, the supply chain and the clients need to get match fit for CP7, but there could be a really perfect world where we run those two programs in parallel, and we don't just decarbonise, we achieve some really good extra benefits for the railway.
Thank you, David. We've got a question from Luke. He's asked, besides the high cost to implement, is there any disadvantage to a 100% electrified system?
Apart from the cost, the other one is the one that was the question that was asked before about embedded carbon. But embedded carbon will be included in part of the business case. Sometimes people would say aesthetics, and it's certainly possible to design uglier electrification. It's equally possible to design relatively aesthetic electrification. I would suggest you compare and contrast the Royal Border Bridge at Berwick with, for example, some of the electrification on the Great Western. So you can design fairly aesthetic electrification. But I just don't think, if there are other technologies available like hydrogen and battery, why would you electrify a very long, lightly used rural branch? I just think it doesn't make a great deal of sense.
Thank you. We've had a question from Febby, which is, what is the plan and trends in alternative countries? Are they heavily investing in electrification, or are they investing towards self-powered trains?
Well, that's a really good question. And it depends where you start from. So most other developed countries are already at least 60% electrification. What they're doing so they're adopting the same sort of rationale as we are, but they start from a much better place where they've got a much higher proportion of their network electrified. So you see in Germany, they are doing more electrification but they're also investing in, so for example, there's a fleet of hydrogen trains being deployed in Germany. They've done exactly the same exercise as we have, and they've come up with a very similar solution. So electrify the intensively used and freight bits of the network, and for those bits that don't justify electrification, then it's by and large hydrogen passenger trains or battery where the distances aren't great. So they've come up with a very similar solution, but they start much further down the line. We are 40% electrified. Germany is 65%. And surprisingly enough, Germany is one of the less electrified places because when with the reunification of Germany, most of East Germany wasn't electrified, so they've been catching up on that since 1990.
Thank you. We had a question slightly related to the hydrogen trains, and you touched on in your 100% electrification that you wouldn't necessarily advocate 100% electrification. So Vipul's asked, how does the electrification cost compare per mile with other initiatives such as battery or hydrogen trains?
It's not really a direct comparison, because you've got to look at the whole. There's no doubt about it. Electrification is expensive, and you can only justify it if you've got enough trains under the wire to give you the revenue that justifies that. Because electric trains are cheaper to run than diesel trains, but you've also got to pay for the infrastructure. Train for train, you can't really make it. It's a difficult comparison to make. So if you're on a lightly used line, you wouldn't be able to justify electrification because you wouldn't be earning enough revenue. So you've got to balance the costs with the revenue.
Mm-hmm. Are you okay for another question?
I'm okay for another 5 or 10 minutes if people have got the patience.
Yeah, well, we've got plenty of questions. One comes in from Samuel, and he asks, considering the past history of delays and cost overruns in railway projects, do you think 25 years of decarbonisation output planned in advance is sensible? And how will the output be ensured? Should smaller sections be planned and proved to be proved to the public first?
Okay, well, I'd like to think that we've already proven the ability. So first of all, I'd challenge the track record of failure so we have had some notable failures, let's be honest. So Great Western, which I talked about, is a notable failure. But as I showed, 75% of the projects delivered in that period were delivered successfully. So providing we learn from those lessons, then we should be able to deliver the majority and hopefully 100% of projects cost effectively. As I mentioned, I think we can demonstrate that, and we have learned our ability to deliver that, because as I mentioned, Midland Main Line and the last phase of Great Western have both been delivered at that efficient cost range of less than £1.5 million a single track kilometre. What I fear is that if we don't put a few more projects into the system between now and 2025 to keep not just the existing teams going, but also to build up the capabilities of new teams. So if you like, we need a training ground of some small, which I think is what the question is suggesting, is if between now and 2025 we have a small number of projects that keep the existing capability in being and build it up, so that we can then deliver that 450 kilometers a year from 2025 onwards. And guess what? Just like the German lesson, if you do the same thing year after year after year, project after project, you get continuous improvement, and you will drive the costs down over time. And that's what the Germans have found. So I think we already are delivering efficiently. I think we need to keep that keep that capability in being between now and 2025, and get ourselves, as I say, match fit for that 20, this is a mixed metaphor, a 25-year sprint of 450 kilometers a year, and we will get really, really good at that.
Thank you very much for that. We've had a question from Ed, and he's suggesting, in the meantime, is a good temporary solution a diesel engine hauling modified coaches, i.e. a Mark 3 or 4, which can then be replaced with an electric or hydrogen loco when electrification technology is available?
Yeah, I mean that could be a solution. The locomotives that might be available aren't necessarily the cleanest things in the world from a carbon perspective, but I'm not sure that that's actually necessary because we've got quite a lot of rolling stock available. If you needed a diesel passenger train right now capable of doing 125 miles an hour, there's a few HSTs available, for example. We've had another boom and bust example I could give is the one of rolling stock. So in the past 5 years, we've replaced half the national fleet, which has inevitably displaced quite a lot of trains still with useful life. So we've got lots of new trains being introduced, and so there are some good trains out there which could do exactly that kind of duty and provide an interim solution in that transition phase. And one of the great benefits of bi-mode is that they'll really strongly support the transition, because if you imagine moving the frontier of where the electrification ends each year, then that just allows the bi-mode to spend more time running electrically, and you just move that frontier forward every year. The last thing I would want to countenance is diesel trains running under the wires. So the one big disadvantage with loco haul trains is if you run them under the wires, then that's completely counterproductive.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for your time, David. It's been a fantastic presentation. There's been a few questions posted that aren't questions so much as thanking you for your presentation. You've definitely got a bit of a fan club according to the questions box. So thank you very much for taking your time
Thank you for the invitation.
out to speak to us. And we wish you all the best, and hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Well, thank you very much. I'm off to go and enjoy a barbecue now.
Thank you very much, David.
Everybody has a good evening.
Thank you, everyone, for turning up. Thank you.